Spanish Teacher, Beginner Spanish. Beginner Lesson 7, Boot Verbs. During this lesson, you will learn what a boot verb is, how to conjugate boot verbs, and the most common boot verbs in the Spanish language. All right, let's talk about boot verbs for a moment. First, what is a boot verb? A boot verb is a verb that is conjugated normally. However, when you conjugate the verb, you have to change a different part of the word, and that part is the stem. So the stem of the verb changes when you conjugate a boot verb. That's what makes it a boot verb, is you are required to change the stem. Now you may ask, well, what part of the verb is the stem? So imagine your verb in front of you, and in your mind, draw a line up and down through the middle of the verb. The part to the right is the conjugated part that you've conjugated on your own according to what we've learned in previous lessons. The part of the verb to the left is actually considered the stem of the verb, and that is the part of the word that changes a little bit. So we're actually changing two parts of the mother verb. We're taking the mother verb and we're conjugating it just as we always would, but we're also taking the stem of the mother verb and we're changing it slightly as well. Now, one thing to remember is that the stem changes only for 8 of the 10 subjects on the Spanish subject chart. Let's take a look. Here is our Spanish subject chart. You'll notice there are 10 subjects: yo, tú, él, ella, usted, nosotros, vosotros, ellos, ellas, ustedes. These are the 10 subjects in Spanish. Now let me introduce you to the boot. Here is the boot. So these are the 8 subjects: yo, tú, él, ella, usted, ellos, ellas, ustedes. We are going to look at a list of boot verbs. All the verbs on this list require you to change the stem when any of these 8 subjects are used. Let's take a look. Before we take a look at our first example, let me explain something. In addition to conjugating the verb as we've discussed in previous lessons, whenever you deal with boot verbs, you'll also have to change the stem of the boot verb when any of those 8 subjects are used. Now, there's a wide variety of boot verbs. They all look different, and they can be grouped into 3 buckets as follows. The first bucket are those boot verbs where the stem changes from E to IE. The second bucket of boot verbs are those verbs where the stem changes from O to UE. And the third bucket are those verbs where the stem changes from E to I. These are the 3 buckets of boot verbs. Every boot verb you ever deal with will fall into one of these 3 buckets. Let's take a look at the first example. This first example is one where the stem changes from E to IE. Let's take a look. The verb is sentir, which means to feel. Now, if we were to apply what we've learned in the past, we would incorrectly conjugate sentir in the yo form to yo siento. But now that we know about boot verbs, we understand that sentir is a boot verb and we must change the stem as well. So like I said, this is an example where the E changes to IE. So instead of yo siento, the correct conjugation for sentir is yo siento, or I feel. If tú is the subject, the verb conjugates tú sientes. Tú sientes. Ella siente. Ella siente. Él siente. Usted siente. Ellos sienten. Ellas sienten. Ustedes sienten. Those are the subjects that fit inside the boot. Now notice, nosotros sentimos. We still conjugate the verb, but we do not change the stem. Nosotros sentimos. Vosotros sentís. Let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at our second example. The verb is contar, which means to count. And remember, boot verbs fall into one of three buckets. Contar is an example of where O changes to UE. Now we're going to follow the same steps we've discussed in previous lessons to conjugate contar. If yo is the subject, we're going to drop the AR and we're going to add the appropriate conjugation, which in this case is O. At the same time, because contar is a boot verb, we're going to change the stem. We'll change O to UE. So we get cuento, or yo cuento. Tú cuentas. Usted cuenta. Ella cuenta. Él cuenta. Ellos cuentan. Ustedes cuentan. Ellas cuentan. Those are the subjects and verbs that fall in the boot. Notice that contamos and contáis are not in the boot, hence we don't change the stem for those two. Let's take a look at a third example. The verb is seguir, which means to follow or to continue. Now this is an example of where E changes to I. So instead of yo sigo, we drop the IR and the U in this case, and we add an O. At the same time, we change the stem from SEG to SIG, so the E changes to an I, and we get yo sigo. Tú sigues. Ella sigue. Ellas siguen. Notice, seguimos and seguís do not fall inside the boot. Therefore, we do not change the stem for those two.